Hey guys, tonight we're going to find out how people got through a medieval winter. 4 months of cold and darkness that the whole rest of the year was quietly spent preparing for. If these long, slow histories are your sort of thing, a like or a subscribe genuinely helps the channel along, though only if you actually enjoy what happens here. And I'm always a little curious where in the world these recordings end up playing, so if the mood takes you, leave a comment saying where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Reading through them is one of the nicest parts of making these. Now, let's go back a long way to a village in the north of Europe in the middle of November. The leaves are gone, not falling. Gone, weeks ago, stripped off in a gale sometime in late October, and trodden since then into a brown paste in the lane. The fields beyond the houses have been ploughed and sown with winter corn, and they lie in long dark ridges, glazed here and there with standing water that has begun to take a skin of ice around its edges. The hedgerows are bare and black, and full of nothing at all. There is a smell in the air of wet earth and wood smoke and cattle, and it is the smell of the next 4 months. It is about 4 in the afternoon, and the light is already failing, not dramatically. There is no fiery sunset, because at this latitude in November, the sun does not so much set as give up, sliding sideways behind a bank of grey and taking the colour out of the world as it goes. The thatched roofs turn from gold brown to a soft ash colour. And from every roof line, because the air is perfectly still, smoke stands straight up in a thin blue column 20 or 30 feet into the dusk before it loses its nerve and spreads out flat. Every one of those columns of smoke is a household. And every one of those households is about to be shut indoors, together, for the better part of a third of a year. That is the fact tonight is built on, because it is an easy one to miss. We tend to think of winter as an inconvenience, a season of higher heating bills and the mild indignity of scraping a windscreen. For a medieval household, winter was not an inconvenience. It was an annual survival problem, a predictable and non-negotiable one, which arrived on schedule every year and had to be solved every year, in advance. And here is the thing that quietly reframes the whole medieval calendar once you notice it. Almost everything a farming household did in the other 8 months was, in some way, preparation for these 4. The harvest was not simply the reward for a summer's work. It was the loading of the stores. Autumn was not an ending, it was the last chance to fill the loft and salt the barrel and get the wood in. Even the shape of the church year leaned toward it, with a great deal of feasting gathered into the darkest weeks and a season of fasting falling later, when the stores were thinnest. People built their year around the cold, much as a family living beside a river builds its house around the fact that the river floods. So when the smoke goes up straight into a still November afternoon, the household beneath it is not beginning a season. It is closing a door on a plan it has been working at since spring, and finding out whether the plan was good enough. Now, we always talk about the cold. But if you had asked a medieval villager which was worse, there is a fair chance they would have said the dark. At the latitudes where most of northern Europe lives, England, northern France, the German lands, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia most of all, daylight at midwinter falls to 8 hours or fewer, and further north it shrinks further still. That is not a cosmetic change. When the sun is up for 8 hours, and a good part of those hours is the weak brown light of dawn and dusk, the working day simply shrinks to fit, because here is the constraint. Light cost money. Beeswax candles burned clean and bright and sweet-smelling, and they were expensive enough that in many places they were essentially a church item and a rich man's item rather than a household one. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, were far cheaper, but they smoked, they guttered, they smelled distinctly of what they were made from, and they still represented fat, which was food, and which nobody could burn without noticing the cost. The cheapest light of all was the rushlight, a common rush, peeled down to its soft pith, drawn through whatever waste fat the kitchen had, and set at an angle in a little iron holder. A rushlight gives a small, wavering, honey-coloured flame, enough to see a face across a table, and it is said that one of decent length burns for something under half an hour before it needs replacing. It is a humble little technology, and a reminder that every hour of light after sunset was paid for out of the same stores that had to last until spring. So the practical day shrank along with the daylight. You rose in the dark. You did whatever could only be done in daylight while the daylight held, and then, as the light went, life contracted inward toward the one reliable source of warmth and brightness in the building. The evening was not lit. It was firelit, which is a completely different thing. Firelight moves. It makes the walls seem to breathe. It throws the corners of a room into a soft, uncertain dark and gathers everybody's faces into a ring of orange. So let's go inside one of these houses, because the house itself is the first and most important piece of survival equipment anyone owned. The ordinary peasant dwelling across much of medieval northern Europe was small. One room, and a partitioned end, a space you could cross in a few strides. The frame was timber, posts and beams, often oak cut from local woodland and joined with pegs, carrying the whole weight of the building. Between the timbers the walls were wattle and daub. The wattle was a lattice of thin, flexible rods, usually hazel or willow, woven between the uprights like a stiff basket. The daub, packed into and over that lattice from both sides, was a mixture of clay or earth, chopped straw, water, and very often animal dung, which sounds unpromising and is in fact excellent because the fibre binds the mixture and stops it cracking as it dries. Finished and lime-washed, a daub wall is smooth, pale, surprisingly hard, a decent insulator, and repairable by hand. The floor was earth. Beaten earth, trodden down over years into something nearly as hard as tile, and strewn with rushes or straw, swept out and replaced as it grew dirty, and laid fresh for feast days, sometimes with sweet herbs scattered in among it. It was not a carpet. It was a hard-wearing, replaceable covering that kept the damp and the chill of the ground from coming straight up through your feet. The windows were small, and they were not glass. Glass in a window was a church luxury for most of this period, and a rich man's luxury for the rest of it. An ordinary window was a modest opening, often set high in the wall, closed with a solid hinged shutter, or covered with cloth soaked in oil or wax, or in some places with a thin sheet of scraped horn, which let a dim glow through while keeping most of the weather out. Our word window comes from an older northern word, meaning something close to wind-eye, which tells you exactly what the opening was understood to be. The result is a house that is dim even at noon in December. But it is a house that keeps the wind out and the heat in, and in winter that trade was not remotely a close call. Above it all, the roof. Thatch, usually, water reed where it grew, wheat or rye straw where it did not, laid thick and steep so that the rain ran off the surface rather than soaking in. Thatch is a genuinely superb insulator. A properly laid thatched roof, a foot or more deep, holds heat in a way that few modern roofs manage without help. It also leaked as it aged, and had to be patched and eventually stripped and redone, which was skilled work and one of the ordinary costs of having a house. Now, the fire. In an older house, and in a great many houses for a very long time, there was no chimney. The hearth sat in the middle of the floor, a ring of stones, or a raised platform of clay right in the centre of the single room, with the fire burning openly on it. The smoke rose, spread against the underside of the roof, and drifted about until it found its way out under the eaves, or through a small vent, or through a louvered opening in the ridge. Which means the upper part of the room lived permanently beneath a hanging layer of smoke, and anyone who stood up tall would find it, and everybody learned, without ever being told, to sit low. That sounds miserable. And it was, a little. But there is a genuinely counterintuitive benefit here, and it is one of my favourite pieces of accidental medieval engineering. That constant smoke preserved the building. It kept insects out of the thatch and out of the roof. Timbers, it discouraged rot, and it laid down a hard black varnish of soot across the beams that protected the wood beneath. Surveyors today can still recognise some of the oldest surviving houses by their smoke-blackened rafters, a signature written on the roof by generations of fires. The thing that made the room hazy was also, quietly, the thing keeping the roof up. Built flues and proper fireplaces spread gradually through the later Middle Ages, moving down the social scale over generations, first into castles and manor houses, then into the homes of prosperous townsmen, and only much later into ordinary cottages. It is said that a writer looking back from the far end of this period remarked with some astonishment at how many chimneys had lately gone up in places that had never had one. A chimney is cleaner, and it allows an upper floor, which changes a house completely. But it is worth saying that a chimney also sends a great deal of your heat straight up and out of the building, which the open hearth never did. The old smoky room was, in purely thermal terms, rather good at its job. And then there was the other source of heat in the house, which had 4 legs. In many regions, in Wales and the west of England, in Ireland, across Scandinavia, in the Alpine valleys, and in a good deal of northern Europe besides, the family and the animals lived under one roof. The classic form is the longhouse, a single long building divided across its width, people at one end, byre at the other, sometimes with little more than a low partition and a drainage channel between them. The cattle came in as the weather closed, and they stayed in. It is very tempting to read that as squalor. It was not. It was heating. A cow is a large, warm, slow-burning animal that gives off a steady and considerable warmth all night without consuming a single stick of your firewood. A byre full of cattle at one end of a well-built house makes a real difference to the temperature at the other. And the arrangement worked both ways, because the animals were the household's capital. The difference between recovering next year and not. And they were safer inside, safe from the weather, safe from theft, and easily fed and watered in a blizzard without anybody going out into it. People and beasts kept each other alive in the most literal sense. Yes, it smelled. Everyone involved had far more pressing concerns than that. Which brings us to the night, and to bed. A medieval bed, for most people, was a stuffed sack, a large case of linen or hemp filled with straw, or with dried bracken or heather where those grew freely, laid on a low wooden frame or sometimes on the floor itself. The stuffing was shaken up to loosen it, and renewed from time to time, because straw packs down and goes musty. Over that went whatever the household had, woolen blankets, coverlets, worn cloaks pressed into service, animal skins in some places. Wool is the hero of this whole story, and we will come back to it properly. For now, it is enough to say that a heavy woolen blanket, even a coarse one, is a genuinely effective thing to sleep under. And people slept in their clothes. Not the outer layers as a rule, but the linen shift or shirt worn all day stayed on, and rather more than that when the frost was hard. The idea of dedicated nightwear belongs to a later, warmer, richer world. The whole household slept in one room and very often in one bed. Parents, children, elderly relatives, and whoever else belonged to the house bundled together under a shared weight of wool. There is nothing complicated about why. A single body in a cold room loses its heat to the room. Several bodies together lose their heat to one another, which is to say they scarcely lose it at all. It is the same principle as a nest, and it was simply the obvious way to get through a January night in an unheated house. Now, you might reasonably assume the rich were warm, and in one sense of course they were, since they had more of everything that made warmth. But a great hall of stone in February is a genuinely difficult building to heat, and in some real ways the lord in his manor was colder than his tenants in their small, low, thatched, smoke-filled, cattle-warmed houses. Stone holds cold. High roofs carry the heat far above where anybody is standing. Great halls are wide and full of doorways, and doorways make draughts, which is why the great houses hung their walls with cloth. Tapestries and painted hangings were status objects certainly, but their first practical job was to stop draughts and to put a soft layer between a person and a cold stone wall. Beds in wealthy houses were curtained for exactly the same reason, a fabric room within the room holding a pocket of warmed air around the sleeper. The wealthy had proper fireplaces with flues in their private chambers, glass eventually in their windows, and above all, more fine wool and fur, more fuel, and servants to tend the fires. Wealth in a medieval winter did not mean central heating. It meant more blankets, more wood, and more people to bring you both. So the sun goes down properly now over our November village. The shutters are closed and pegged. The cattle are in and settled, shifting and breathing in the dark at the far end of the room. The fire is banked down for the night, coals raked together and covered over so that they will still be alive in the morning, the small nightly ritual that gave us the word curfew, from an old phrase meaning simply to cover the fire, and the last rushlight is out. Somewhere outside, the puddles in the lane are hardening, the ploughed ridges are stiffening, and by morning every blade of grass will be furred white, and the whole world will ring underfoot. The household lies bundled under wool in the smoky dark, breathing slowly, waiting out the first real frost of the year. And they are not afraid of it. They have been getting ready for months. So that was the house then. A shell of timber and earth and thatch, doing its patient best against a season that had all winter to find the gaps. And a shell, on its own, does almost nothing. What made it survivable was the small orange thing burning in the middle of it, and nearly everything a household did between October and April was arranged around keeping that small orange thing alive. We are used to thinking of a fire as something you light. Lighting a fire from nothing meant flint struck against a piece of steel until a spark fell, with any luck, into a scrap of scorched linen or a nest of dry moss and thistledown, and then the delicate business of coaxing that glow into a flame with slow, careful breath in a room that was probably, in a medieval house, it was better understood as something you kept, and that is a different relationship altogether. Damp, and certainly draughty. On a fine dry morning, it might take a couple of minutes. In February, with the tinder gone soft, with the wet and cold fingers refusing to be precise, it could take a great deal longer. So the fire was not put out at night and started again in the morning. It was banked and tended, and carried forward from day to day like a small domestic inheritance. And in many houses it burned more or less continuously from one autumn to the next. In the older sort of house it sat in the middle of the floor, on a slab of stone or a patch of beaten clay with no chimney above it at all. The smoke simply rose, spread out under the roof, and found its way out through the thatch or through a small vented opening in the ridge called a louvre. It sounds like an obvious design fault, but it did quiet work up there. It kept the thatch dry, discouraged the insects that would otherwise have eaten it, and blackened the underside of the roof into a hard, glossy layer that helped preserve the timbers. And the heat, instead of vanishing up a flue, drifted out sideways into the room where the people were. When chimneys and wall fireplaces began to spread in later centuries, they were considered a great improvement, and so they were, but something went with them. A fire against a wall has a front and a back. A fire in the middle of the floor has only a middle, and everyone can sit around it. Over it hung the pot, permanently occupied by pottage, and the fire was warmth and light and cooking and the drying of wet clothes all at once. In some parts of Europe, tax collectors counted households not as families, but as hearths. To have your own fire was, quite literally, to be a household. That fire was hungry, and here is the part that is easy to miss from a distance. Fuel was not a background detail of medieval life. Fuel was work. An open hearth burning through a long evening and smouldering through the night gets through an astonishing quantity of wood, and every stick of it had to be found, carried, split, stacked and dried by somebody. Green wood, cut that season, is full of water and refuses to behave. It hisses and sulks and gives out smoke rather than heat. So wood wanted seasoning, a year standing in a stack under the eaves, before it was worth burning, which meant that the fuel a family burned in a given winter had been gathered in the winter before it, and the fuel for next year was being gathered now. Nobody in that world burned wood spontaneously. They burned the results of a long, patient habit, kept up mostly by women and children, who went out along the hedgerows and the wood edges with a rope or a cloth to bring home whatever the wind had brought down, which raises the question of whose wood it was, and that mattered, because in most of Europe the woodland was not lying about free for the taking. It belonged to somebody, usually to the lord of the manor, and the villagers held rights in it. Not ownership, but rights, of a precise and legalistic kind, argued over in manor courts for centuries. In English law, these were called estovers, and they came in named varieties: the right to take wood for fuel, the right to take wood to repair your house, another for your fences and hedges, and in some places another again for the mending of a plough. Each right had its limits, and the limits were the whole point. You could take what your household actually needed. You could not take a wagon load and sell it in town. The great dividing line, more or less everywhere, ran between dead wood and living wood. Gathering what had already fallen was generally permitted. Taking a green standing tree was theft, plain and simple, and treated as such. It is often said that the old phrase about doing something by hook or by crook comes from exactly this distinction, describing the tools a commoner might use to pull down dead branches from a standing tree without ever laying an axe to it. Whether the phrase truly began there is debated, but the practice behind it is real enough and easy to picture. A woman with a long billhook or a shepherd's crook reaching up into a winter tree and tugging until the dead limb gives with a crack and comes down in a shower of frost. The manor court rolls are full of small fines for people who reached a little further than they should have, and a good deal of medieval village litigation turns out to be neighbours quietly complaining about each other's firewood. But the truly clever thing the medieval world did with wood is not much talked about now. It is coppicing. If you cut certain broadleaf trees down close to the ground, hazel and ash and willow and sweet chestnut, they do not die. They send up a whole crowd of new straight shoots from the stump, which is called the stool, and those shoots grow fast because they are fed by a root system already fully grown. Come back in 7 years, or 10, or 15, depending on the tree, and instead of one trunk you have a dozen clean poles. You cut them, and the stool does the whole thing again. And again. Indefinitely. Some coppice stools worked this way are believed to be many centuries old, still being cut, older by far than any of the houses their poles have warmed. The management of it was elegant. A wood was divided into sections and cut on a rotation, one section a year, so that at any moment it held every stage at once. The freshly cut ground, open to the light and thick with primroses and bluebells. The 2-year growth. The tall, nearly ready stand. And among them a scattering of larger trees left uncut as standards, growing on for building timber. It produced fuel forever, and material as well, hurdles and rakes and barrel hoops and the woven wattle panels that made the walls of the house itself, without ever destroying the wood. Pollarding was the same idea lifted about 8 feet into the air, the tree cut above the height a cow or a deer can reach, so that the regrowth is out of range of hungry mouths. It is why old pollards with their strange swollen heads still stand in the corners of pastures, looking like trees that have been thinking about something for 400 years. Not everywhere had woods. Across much of Ireland, upland Scotland, the fens of eastern England, the moorlands and the flat wet coasts of the Low Countries, the fuel came out of the ground instead. Peat, cut with a long narrow-bladed spade in the early summer, once the ground had drained enough to stand on, sliced out in dark wet bricks and set up on end in little leaning stacks so the wind could get through them. Then left. All summer, turned and restacked and left again, because a wet turf is worth nothing and a dry one will burn all evening. Bringing home the dried turf was one of the great communal labours of the year, and the reward was a fire quite unlike a wood fire. Slow, low, red rather than yellow, with a faint smoke that is one of the most distinctive smells in the world, sweet and earthy, the kind that gets into cloth and hair and stays there. A peat fire does not roar. It sits, and glows, and lasts. Where there was neither wood nor peat enough, people burned whatever else would burn. Dried gorse and furze, which catch quickly and blaze hot and were prized for heating a bread oven. Bracken cut off the hillsides. Heather, dried and bundled. Straw, though straw was wanted for thatch and bedding, so burning it was a small defeat. Driftwood on the coasts, and the roots of old trees dug out of the bog. And in the treeless places, dried animal dung, gathered and stacked and burned exactly as it has been on the plains and uplands of half the world. It was ordinary. Nobody thought about it. It was simply what fuel was, where you happened to live. It had to have fuel brought to it, by cart along bad roads and by barge down rivers, from woods that might be a day or more away, and so firewood arrived in bundles, faggots of tied brushwood and the heavier billets, and was sold in the market like bread or fish, at a price that behaved like any. Townspeople, meanwhile, had no woodland rights at all, and this is the point at which warmth becomes something you buy. A city could not gather its own fuel. It rose in a hard frost. It rose when the roads were too deep in mud for carts. It rose most of all in the weeks when everybody needed it at once, which is a plain way of saying that in a bad winter the cost of not freezing went up precisely when people could least afford it. The poor bought fuel, as the poor have always bought everything, in the smallest quantity at the worst price, an armful at a time, enough for one evening. Charitable bequests in medieval wills sometimes set aside fuel for the poor of a parish in winter, which tells us clearly enough what winter did to those without it. And out in the woods there was another trade going on all through this, one of the loneliest of the age. Charcoal burning. Charcoal is wood that has been cooked rather than burned, stacked in a great dome, covered over with turf and earth to keep the air out, and set smouldering inside so that everything volatile is driven off. What you get burns hotter than wood, with hardly any smoke and hardly any flame, which is why every smith and worker in iron and glass depended on it. But the stack could not be left, not for an hour. If air got in, a fortnight's work would go up in a single bright evening. So the charcoal burner built himself a little hut of poles and turf beside his stack, and lived there, sleeping in short, broken stretches, walking the mound at all hours, plugging the leaks with earth, watching the colour of the smoke change. Charcoal burners had a reputation for being solitary and a little outside ordinary society, which seems less like superstition than an accurate description of anyone who spends most of the year alone in a wood at night, minding a fire that must never be allowed to become a fire. Back in the house, the daily rhythm of the hearth ended with the banking. Last thing at night, the embers were raked into a heap and covered over with a layer of the fine ash the hearth had been making all day. Ash is a beautiful insulator. It smothers the flame but holds the heat in, so that 8 or 9 hours later the coals underneath are still alive, and a little raking and a little kindling and a little breath will bring the whole thing back. In towns this had a name and a bell. The curfew, from the French couvre-feu, cover the fire, was rung in the evening, and at the sound of it households were expected to cover their hearths and put out their lights for the night. It sounds like municipal fussiness until one remembers what a medieval town was made of. Timber frames, thatched or shingled roofs, buildings leaning together across streets barely wide enough for a cart, workshops full of straw and shavings and oil. Fire was the greatest danger of urban life, greater in an ordinary year than any enemy. The curfew bell was not a curfew in our modern sense at all. It was a whole town agreeing out loud once a night to be careful. And when the fire went out anyway, because it did, because someone slept too heavily or the ash was banked too thin, the answer was to go next door. Borrowing fire was an ordinary transaction. Somebody would walk over with a covered pot or an old iron pan, and come back with a few live coals nested in ash, hurrying a little, shielding them from the wind. In some villages, it was a courtesy of no importance whatsoever. In others, there was a social weight to it, a sense that a household forever borrowing fire was not being kept as it ought to be. Either way, on any given winter morning, the fires of a village were quietly related to one another. Coals moved from half to half the way news did, and a single fire could light a whole street. The fire was also, for most people, the light, and this is the part that is hardest to picture properly. Candles existed, but good candles were expensive. Beeswax burned clean and bright and smelled faintly of honey, and it went to churches and to the households of the wealthy. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, were what ordinary people could sometimes afford, and they smoked and guttered and needed their wicks trimmed constantly. Humbler still, and far commoner, was the rushlight. A rush stripped of most of its green skin, leaving a slender pith with a supporting strip along one side, drawn through hot fat and left to set. Pinched at an angle in a little iron holder, it gave a small clear flame, and it is said that a good long one might last a fair part of an hour. That was the unit of the evening, not hours, but rushlights. And whatever burned left something behind in the air, a haze that hung in the roof and drifted slowly out through the thatch and settled, over the years, into the black shine on the rafters overhead. But mostly there was the hearth, and the hearth was enough, and this shaped the winter evening more than anything else. Light and warmth came from one place, so everybody went to that place. There was no dispersing into separate rooms because there was no point, and often no separate room. The household gathered into a single lit circle, the smallest ones nearest, and did the work that could be done by firelight and by feel, spinning, carding wool, mending harness, whittling handles, sewing, shelling beans, hands busy, faces half lit, backs cold. And when hands are busy for 4 dark hours every night for 5 months, and everyone is within arm's reach of everyone else, what fills the time is talking. Riddles and gossip and long circling arguments, songs everybody already knew. Nearly everything we think of as the traditional culture of the countryside, the tales and the ballads and the proverbs, the whole inherited body of things people simply knew, was made and remade in that circle, by firelight, in winter, because that was the only time of year with enough hours of stories told by people who had told them 50 times before, to listeners who could correct them if they got a detail wrong, enforced indoor darkness to make it. A fire, for all its virtues, only ever warms the side of you that is turned towards it. There is a strange arithmetic to it, familiar to anyone who has sat at an open hearth, the shins glowing, the back still cold, and the slow rotation people perform without quite noticing. A fire is also fixed, it stays where it was built. And almost everything that actually had to be done in a medieval winter happened somewhere else, out beyond the doorway, in the weather. The foddering of the animals, the fetching of water, the threshing in the barn, the walk to church, the trudge to the woodpile in the blue half-light before dawn. For all those hours, the only warmth a person had was the warmth they were wearing, which is why medieval clothing is best thought of, not as costume and not as fashion, but as architecture, a small portable house made of cloth, patched and repatched, worn until it was more mend than fabric. And that house, almost without exception, was built out of wool. Wool was the foundation of Northern European survival, and it saturated ordinary life completely. Sheep were everywhere. On the downs and the moors, on the stubble fields and the salt marshes, on thin uplands where nothing else would grow. Whole regions were shaped by them. English wool travelled across the sea to the looms of Flanders, and further south to Italy, and the trade in it made merchants rich and kings solvent and market towns important. But long before any of that, the fleece did a much simpler job, which was to keep the person who had raised it from freezing. The reason wool mattered so much is a matter of physics rather than sentiment. Each wool fibre is crimped and springy rather than straight, so a mass of wool is mostly air held still in thousands of tiny pockets, and still air is one of the best insulators there is. That much would be true of any fluffy thing. What makes wool extraordinary is what happens when it gets wet. Wool can take up a remarkable amount of moisture before it even feels damp to the hand, and it goes on holding its loft and its warmth while it does so. Linen, soaked, clings and chills. Wet leather goes stiff and cold. Wool wet is heavy and smells of sheep, and it still keeps you alive. In a northern winter, where the real enemy is rarely a dry, still cold and very often a raw dripping drizzle a few degrees above freezing, that single property was worth more than almost anything else a person could own. None of it, though, arrived ready-made. Between the sheep on the hill and the coat on the back lay an enormous quantity of patient human work. The fleece had to be sorted and washed, combed or carded until the fibres lay obediently in one direction, and then spun. Every thread of it, by hand, on a distaff and a hanging spindle, twisted out of a cloud of fibre by fingers that no longer needed to look. It could be done walking or minding a pot, and so it was. Spinning filled the margins of the day for generations of women, which is why the word spinster meant simply a woman who spun. It is said that it took several spinners to keep one weaver supplied. Thread was slow, and cloth stayed precious because the hours inside it were real. A fact that explains almost everything else about how clothing was treated. Most of that cloth, most of the time, was not dyed at all. Sheep are not only white. There are browns and greys and blacks, dark fawns and creamy off-whites, and the plainest cloth simply took its colour from the animal. Russet and hodden grey, the coarse undyed cloths, clothed the great mass of country people, and a medieval village in January is best pictured in those tones. Oatmeal, mushroom, mole, ash, the colours of a winter hedge. That said, the countryside was not as drab as we tend to imagine. Madder gave reds, weld and onion skins and lichens gave yellows and golds, woad gave blues from the palest sky to something close to black. What cost money was not colour as such, but depth and fastness, a dye that would not go patchy after a season of rain. That is why deep, saturated colour read as wealth, and why a scarlet, in the medieval sense, meant a cloth of the very best quality rather than simply a shade. As for how it was all worn, it is easiest to work outward from the skin. Next to the body came linen, a shirt for a man, a shift or smock for a woman, and for men a pair of linen brays, loose in the earlier centuries and neater later on. Linen against the skin, wool over it, and that order almost never changed for two practical reasons. Wool worn directly against the body itches, and, more importantly, the linen took the wear. Linen could be washed hard, woolen cloth could not, without shrinking or losing its shape. So the cheap, washable layer protected the expensive one, and the expensive one did the warming. It is a neat system, and it lasted for centuries. Over the linen went the wool proper. A tunic for a man, ending somewhere between the thigh and the knee for a labourer, and longer for men of standing, since length was a quiet way of announcing that you did not need to move quickly. A gown or kirtle for a woman, fitted through the body and falling to the feet. In colder weather, another layer over that. An over-tunic, a surcoat, a second gown. Because before there was such a thing as a coat as we understand it, the answer to cold was simply more of the same. On the legs, hose, not knitted stockings, which came later, but shaped tubes cut from cloth on the diagonal, so they had a little give, fastened up to a belt, or, in time, joined into a single garment. Or, humbler and older and perfectly effective, long strips of cloth wound round the calf, the leg wrappings that appear on carved and painted figures across northern Europe. And over everything, the cloak. The mantle, the great outer wrap, was the true winter garment, and often the single most valuable thing an ordinary person wore. A half circle or a full circle of heavy cloth, pinned or broached or simply held closed at the throat, sometimes with a hood attached and sometimes with a separate hood over it. Some hoods came with a little shoulder cape covering the upper back and chest, which is exactly where a cold wind wants to go, and some had a long tail hanging behind, which looks purely decorative until you notice it can be wound round the throat or used to hang the whole thing on a peg. The cloak was what you shook the snow from in the doorway. The cloak was what you slept under. What made a cloak genuinely weatherproof was a process, and one of the quiet marvels of medieval technology. Woven woolen cloth, straight off the loom, is loose and open and not much use against wind. So it was fulled, soaked and pounded and worked until the fibres crept into one another and locked, and the cloth thickened and shrank into something closer to felt. Originally this was done by hand and foot, people treading it in a trough of water and full as earth, and an old-fashioned alkaline wash whose ingredients we can politely leave in the trough where they belong. It was then stretched on frames, raised with teasels and sheared smooth, and what came out was a dense, wind-stopping cloth that could be cut without fraying and would turn a good deal of rain. From around the 12th and 13th centuries, watermills took over the pounding, hammers rising and falling all day beside the river, and fulling mills spread quickly enough that some historians have called it a small industrial revolution of its own. Whatever we call it, the effect on ordinary life was warmth, better cloth, more of it, more cheaply. You can still hear the trade in the surnames it left behind: Fuller, Walker, Tucker. Then there is fur, and here a common assumption needs correcting. Fur was not only for lords, it was insulation, and everybody who could get it used it. The difference lay in which animal. Sheepskin and lambskin were the workhorses, worn with the wool turned inward, and a sheepskin coat is still the traditional winter garment across half of upland Europe, for the excellent reason that nothing warmer was ever invented. Rabbit, hare, squirrel, fox, goat, even cat lined the garments of perfectly ordinary households, sewn inside a gown where nobody sees it and every part of you feels it. Ermine, marten, and sable were another matter, and their whole point was to be seen. Rank showed at the collar and the cuffs. Authorities in several countries grew sufficiently exercised about people dressing above their station that they passed sumptuary laws, England's best-known attempt coming in the 14th century, setting out which cloths and furs belonged to which degree of person. Those laws appear to have been comprehensively ignored, which tells you something rather cheering about human beings. The head and the hands mattered more than we tend to remember, because a body loses heat quickly from an uncovered head, and because hands that have gone numb cannot work, and work was what winter mostly consisted of. Nearly everybody wore something on the head, indoors and out, all year round, a linen coif tied under the chin, a felted or later a knitted cap, a hood pulled up, a straw hat in the fields, a veil and wimple for married women. Bareheadedness belonged to children, and to moments of prayer and respect. Over the hands went mittens, far more often than gloves, because fingers kept together share their heat, and fingers apart lose it, and a labourer's might be thick leather for handling thorn and timber, or heavy felted wool, or even plaited straw. Hands still took a beating, and chilblains were simply part of a northern winter, an ordinary nuisance, mentioned in passing rather as we might mention a cough, and left in passing here too. Feet were the losing battle. Medieval shoes were turn shoes, sewn inside out, and then turned the right way round, so the seams sat inside, which made them supple and close-fitting, with a thin leather sole and no heel to speak of. They were superb for walking, and hopeless for standing about in slush. So people improvised. Straw or hay or dried moss was stuffed inside for insulation, and replaced when it packed down, and lengths of cloth were wound round the foot. And beneath the shoe went the pattern, a wooden overshoe on little raised stilts, strapped on with leather, which lifted the wearer up out of the mud and melt water of a winter street, and made a companionable clacking on stone. Worn thin at the ball of the foot, they turn up in town after town, and must have made every market day sound like slow rain. Even so, the honest truth is that people were often wet from the ankle down from November to March, and got used to it, and dried their shoes by the fire at night, taking care not to dry them too close, because leather that dries too fast goes hard as a board. A cloak hung on its peg near the hearth after a day in the rain steams very gently, and gives off something earthy and animal and faintly sweet, sheep and lanolin and wood smoke folded together, and it drifts through the room for hours, while the cloth slowly stops dripping and settles for merely. There is a smell that belongs to all of this, and it is one of the most particular smells in history, wet wool drying indoors. Being damp. Add the low crackle of the fire and the smell of ash and of whatever is in the pot, and you have the interior weather of a medieval winter evening, dim, smoky, close, and made almost entirely of wool and wood and breath. Washing did not stop for the cold, but it changed shape. It was the linen that got washed, soaked in a lye of wood ash and water, pounded, rinsed and spread to dry, which in winter meant draping it near the fire or up in a loft, or laying it on frozen ground where it would go stiff as a plank and, strangely, dry all the same. Changing one's linen was the accepted measure of cleanliness, and a person with a decent stock of shifts could feel fresh without immersing themselves in water at all, just as well in an unheated house in January. It is worth pausing on what clothes were worth. They appear in wills. People left gowns and cloaks to their children by name. One good gown to a daughter, a fur-lined coat to a nephew, and these were not sentimental gestures but real property, among the most valuable things a household owned. Every town of any size had a brisk trade in second-hand clothing, and garments were unpicked, turned, recut, and handed on until they finally went for rags. Underneath all of that lies a harder fact, better said plainly than skipped. Some people simply did not have enough. A person with one thin garment and no cloak had a very bad winter, and might not come through it, and everyone knew that perfectly well, which is why the giving of clothing to the poor sat so high among the works of mercy. It is also why the best-loved story about St. Martin, whose feast falls in November, just as the cold comes on, is the one in which he divides his cloak and gives half of it to a beggar shivering at the gate. That story stayed close to people's hearts for 1,000 years, because everybody hearing it understood exactly what half a cloak was worth in November. At night, the clothing did not really stop. It only changed position. Many people slept in the shift, or the shirt they had worn all day, which was warm, practical, and no odder than pyjamas, and most wore something on the head, a soft nightcap or coif, because a chamber in January was genuinely cold, and the head was the part that stayed out in it. And then, over the blankets and the coverlet, went everything else the household owned. The cloak first, spread wide, then the gown, then the spare tunic if there was one, layered on the bed exactly as they had been layered on the body, until the whole wardrobe of the house lay on top of the house. Wills sometimes make no clear distinction between bedding and outerwear, and there is no reason they should have. If you had walked through a village on a hard, clear night in January and asked where the warmest place in the parish was, the answer would not have been any hearth at all. It would have been wherever the animals were. Plenty of people lived in buildings where the family had one end and the beasts the other, and while we might picture that as a hardship, they understood it as an arrangement that worked both ways. The animals were sheltered, and the household got a slow, living, unpaid fire at the far end of the. A cow standing in the dark gives off heat steadily, patiently, all night long, a great deal more than a person does, and a byre of cattle under a low roof and a thick thatch, with a good depth of straw underfoot, was a warm, close, breathing space, thick with the smell of hay and hide. Room. On the coldest nights of the year, the beasts were the best stove anyone had, and they were only one of the ways the animals of a farm carried a household through to spring. because a winter had to be eaten as well as worn. Warm clothes could carry a body through a cold morning, but no amount of wool ever fed anyone. The larger half of surviving a medieval winter was settled months before the first hard frost, in the ordinary green weeks of late summer and autumn. And it came down to one plain question that every household in Europe had to answer honestly. How much is there, and how far will it go? The year had a hinge in it, and everybody knew where the hinge was. In much of northern Europe it fell around Martinmas, the feast of St. Martin of Tours, on the 11th of November. By then the harvest was in, the last of the grazing had gone brown and sparse, and the season had made its position perfectly clear. Grass stops growing when the soil cools. Hay and straw and pea haul and whatever else had been cut and stacked for fodder existed in a fixed and countable quantity, and there was no way to make any more of it until spring. So the household did its arithmetic, in the practical sense if not on paper. This many mouths, animal and human. This much feed. This many weeks of winter. Some old calendars simply called November the slaughter month, which was not poetry, it was the answer to the sum. The labour calendars painted into the margins of prayer books show the same sequence repeating all over Europe, year upon year. October or November brings a figure with a long stick standing in a wood, knocking down acorns and beech mast for the pigs gathered underneath, fattening them for nothing at all on food the forest had grown by itself. In England, the right to turn pigs into the Lord's woodland in autumn had its own name, pannage, and its own small fee, because every acorn a pig ate was fodder that did not come out of the stack. Then the page turns, and it is November, and the fattening is over. What followed was ordinary farm work, done every year, and in most households it took a single day. The animals that could not be carried through the cold were taken for the household's meat in the second week of November, and by that evening the whole attention of the house had moved on to the part that actually mattered. It is worth saying that the old picture of a countryside killing off nearly everything each autumn has been gently corrected by later study. Breeding stock was kept, and many regions had fodder enough to carry a good share of the herd through. But the principle held everywhere. You kept what you could feed, and what you could not feed became the winter store. And the store was the whole point, because fresh meat left to itself in a damp northern autumn is worth nothing within a few days. The reason for the timing, and for the gathered neighbours, and the borrowed tubs, was never the day's work itself. It was the keeping. Everything depended on turning a short spell of fresh food into 4 or 5 months of stored food, quickly and correctly. Martinmas was a feast for a simple reason. For one brief stretch there was fresh meat in a world that hardly ever had any, and the work was hard and sociable and worth marking. Then the real business began. The real business, almost everywhere, meant salt. It is difficult now to feel how enormous salt was, sitting on the table costing nothing, thought of as a flavour. To a medieval household it was closer to a machine, the single most important preservation technology of the age and, for most of Europe, the only dependable one. Salt draws the water out of meat, and what cannot stay wet cannot spoil. Hams and sides of bacon were packed down in dry salt, or steeped in brine strong enough to float an egg, in wooden tubs kept in the coldest corner of the house and watched all winter for any sign of the brine going cloudy. Fat was rendered down and set in crocks because fat kept. Because of all that, salt was never a kitchen item. It was a strategic commodity with a geography of its own. Around the Mediterranean and along the warm Atlantic coasts, it was raked out of shallow pans where the sun did the work, and the coarse grey bay salt of western France went north by the shipload. In the colder north, where sun could not be relied on, brine springs were boiled down over great fires that ate whole forests. The German town of Lüneburg grew rich on its brine and sent it out across the Baltic, and the salt towns of Cheshire still carry in their names an old word for a place where brine is boiled. Roads existed for no other purpose than to carry salt, and rulers taxed it because everybody had to buy it and nobody could refuse. It is said that more than one long quarrel between neighbouring powers came down, underneath all the fine language, to who held the pans. The least glamorous substance imaginable, and half a continent's winter was standing on it. The second method cost nothing at all, only patience and a roof. In a house with an open hearth and no chimney, the smoke had to go somewhere, and where it went was up into the rafters, where it loitered in a warm blue haze under the thatch before finding its way out through the gable. That space was already a smokehouse. Nobody had to build it. So flitches of bacon and lengths of sausage, and in some places fish as well, were hung up in the dark among the roof timbers and left there. And week by week the smoke did its quiet work, drying them, sealing them, laying down a bit of varnish of soot that kept the air out. Months later they came down blackened on the outside and good underneath. It is one of the tidiest arrangements in domestic history, this business of a nuisance being turned into a larder, and it explains a great deal about the smell of a medieval house in January. Smoke and salt and fat and damp wool and old ash. None of it pleasant exactly, but all of it meant provision, and the blackened beams above people's heads were the household's savings, hanging in plain view. Where the air was cold and dry and moving, no salt was needed at all, and that fact built the fortunes of entire towns. In the far north of Norway, on the islands off the coast, cod were split and hung over wooden racks in the freezing spring wind and left to the weather. No smoke, no salt, nothing but air. What came off those racks months later was stockfish, dried so hard it could be stacked like timber and shipped like timber, effectively imperishable, and merchants carried it south through Bergen and out across the whole of Europe. Cooking it was a small campaign in itself. The fish had to be beaten with a mallet to break it open, then soaked for days with the water changed again and again before it would consent to become supper. Beside it stood the herring, salted down in barrels, which fed a great part of Europe through winter and through Lent. Vast shoals came into the Sound between Denmark and Sweden each autumn, and for a few weeks the beaches there held one of the great markets of the medieval world, with Baltic salt arriving by ship to meet the fish as they came out of the water. Yarmouth on the English coast held its own herring fair. It is said that when the shoals shifted their grounds, the fortunes of such places shifted with them, which is a hard way to learn how much of a town can rest on something as small as a herring. Then there was the milk, which had been quietly turning itself into winter food since May. A cow or a ewe gives generously in the green months and very little in the cold ones, and nobody had any way of keeping milk itself for more than a day. So the summer's milk was converted into forms that would sit still and wait. Butter was churned and salted heavily and packed into casks, and in Ireland casks of it were sometimes sunk into peat bogs, where the cold sour ground kept it so long that farmers still turn up the occasional buried cask centuries later. Cheese was better yet, especially the hard cheeses pressed dry, which grew fierce and durable with age and could hang or sit for months. The dairy foods were called the white meats, and they were understood as the ordinary provision of ordinary people, a little looked down upon by those who could afford otherwise. But a dairy year, seen properly, was a system of banking. The grass became milk, the milk became cheese, and the cheese carried the strength of a June meadow forward into February, when there was no grass anywhere and no meadow to be seen. The grain sat apart from all of this in the barn, still in the ear. Threshing was deliberately left undone, because grain keeps far better in the straw than loose, and because it was the perfect job for winter. Through the short dark days 2 or 3 people would stand on the swept threshing floor with flails, beating the sheaves in a slow alternating rhythm that carried a long way across frozen fields, one of the sounds that told a traveller at once that a place was inhabited. The great barn doors stood opposite one another for a reason. Opened, they made a draught, and the threshed grain was tossed up in shallow baskets so the wind took the chaff away and let the heavy seed fall back. It was cold, dusty, monotonous work, and it went on all winter because it did not need to be finished, only continued. The grain that came off the floor went into sacks and chests and raised granaries, set up off the ground on stones, and from that moment the household was at war on 2 fronts, against damp and against rodents. Damp meant mould, rodents meant simple theft. Cats earned their place at the fire honestly, and nobody who had spent a summer growing that grain took the loss of any of it lightly. A portion had already gone to the tithe and to autumn rents, which was its own arithmetic, and not always a kind one. And before a single measure of what remained was counted as food, one part was set aside and treated as untouchable, whatever else happened. That was the seed corn for the spring sowing, and it was not the household's to eat. To eat the seed was to buy a week of dinners now and lose the whole of the following year. And that piece of arithmetic was understood by everyone, everywhere, without needing to be explained. Around the house lay the garden, and the garden was mostly roots and cabbages, which is where a modern imagination has to be corrected. There were no potatoes, and would be none in Europe for centuries yet. No tomatoes, no maize, no runner beans, none of the American plants that later took over the northern kitchen entirely, and no carrots in the orange sense we mean, though pale and purple kinds were slowly becoming known. What there was instead was turnips, which were both supper and cattle food, and never really got the respect they deserved. Parsnips, which sweeten in the frost and were prized for exactly that. Skirret, a sweet little root now almost forgotten. Onions and leeks and garlic in quantity, plated and hung up dry. And above all the brassicas, kale and colewort, and the loose old cabbages, which are the great unsung heroes of a northern winter because they stand out in the weather and keep growing, slowly and stubbornly, in cold that has finished off everything else. Roots were lifted before the ground set hard and stored in cool cellars, or laid in heaps on straw out in the field and covered over with more straw and a skin of earth, a clamp which kept them dark and just above freezing. Opening a clamp in February and finding it sound was a genuinely good moment in a thin month. Grain also went into store in liquid form, which is the most sensible way to think about ale. It was not treated as an indulgence. It was food, and it was safe, and small ale weak enough for children was drunk all day by everyone in the house. Before hops came into general use in the north, ale had almost no preservative in it and turned within a week, so brewing was not a seasonal event, but a small perpetual chore, done at home mostly by women, a few gallons at a time, the whole house smelling briefly of warm bread. Every batch was a portion of the harvest put into a jug. In orchard country the same logic wore a different coat. In Normandy and the west of England, the autumn apples and the hard little perry pears went to the press, and cider and perry stood in barrels in the cold to be drawn off through the dark months, and a farm that had a good orchard year felt richer in January than one that did not. The last of it was the small store, the odds and corners that made the difference between grim and bearable. Apples and pears laid out in the loft on straw, never touching each other, looked over regularly, and the bad ones taken out at once, because the old proverb about one rotten apple spoiling the barrel began as a piece of storeroom advice long before anybody used it about people. Honey in crocks sealed with wax, the household's only real sweetness, since sugar was an expensive foreign spice. Hazelnuts and walnuts in sacks, and in the mountains of the south, chestnuts dried and ground into a flour that carried whole villages. And peas and beans dried hard and poured into chests, the great quiet staple of the medieval winter. None of it, it should be said plainly, made for delicate eating. Salted meat had to be soaked before it was fit for the pot, sometimes overnight and sometimes twice over with the water thrown away between, and it came out grey and firm and tasting a good deal of the tub it had been living in. Butter kept a year went strong. Cheese kept a year went sharp enough to argue with. The winter table was salty and smoky and repetitive, and people were perfectly aware of it, and they ate it gratefully anyway, because the alternative was never a nicer dinner. The alternative was nothing. Stores could fall short. A wet harvest, a poor hay year, a wrong guess in November, and a household would be eating thinly long before spring. And that happened often enough that everyone understood the risk without discussing it. All of which produced in the end one thing: pottage. A pot hung over the fire more or less permanently, holding grain and pulses and whatever roots and greens were to hand, cooked long and slow into something thick and plain and warm. It was extended rather than finished, topped up with water and more barley or more peas, kept going for days, adjusted with a handful of dried herbs from the rafters and, on a good day, a small piece of bacon or saltfish for savour. There is an old rhyme, from long after our period, that remembers peas porridge kept 9 days, and it was hardly exaggerating. This was what winter actually tasted like for most people in Europe for a very long time, not the roast on the Lord's table. This. Warm, filling, monotonous and reliable, and it deserves rather more affection than it usually gets, because behind every bowl of it stood the salt tub and the smoky rafters and the clamp in the field and the barn floor and the long summer's work of an entire household. The store was finite, everybody knew the number, and the pot was the number being spent one quiet day at a time. And so the stores are full, or as full as they are ever going to be. The salt has done its quiet work, the crocks are sealed and set away in the cool dark, the grain is in the bin, the turnips lie clamped under their blanket of earth and straw, and the pottage pot has begun its long, slow winter of being emptied and filled and emptied again. To a modern eye that looks rather like the end of the story, the harvest gathered, the door shut against the weather, and what follows, a long, dull, well-provisioned wait until the world turns green again. But here is the thing medieval people understood in their bones, and that we have very nearly forgotten. The dangerous part of the year was not December. December, in an ordinary year, was really rather good. The apples were still sound in the loft, the year's work was finished, and the church calendar filled the darkest weeks with the fast of Advent, and then with Christmas and the 12 days that followed, which were genuine holidays, genuinely kept, with feasting and firelight and a great deal of. The animals that could not be carried through the winter had been dealt with in the autumn, which meant that for a few weeks there was fresh meat in households that saw fresh meat very rarely. The new ale was ready, the nuts were in, sleeping. If a person had to live 1 month of the medieval year, and could choose which, they might very sensibly choose December. The cold was real, and the dark was very long, but the shelves were full, and everybody knew it. The trouble came later. It came in February and March, and the first weeks of April, in that long grey stretch when the stalls had dwindled to their last corners and the new growth had not yet begun. Gardeners still have a name for it, a very old name, and it is exactly right. They call it the Hungry Gap. The arithmetic of it is simple enough to be sobering. Everything a household had to eat between one harvest and the next was a fixed quantity, laid down in the autumn, and from that moment it could only ever get smaller. Nothing was added, nothing came in. No market could conjure grain out of a season that had not happened yet, and even if one could have, most families had little or no money to spend at it. So the pile went down. It went down every day at the rate a household eats, and a little faster, because a barn is not a sealed vessel. Mice found it, and rats and weevils working quietly through the sacks. Damp got into a corner and turned a measure of good grain into something fit only for the pigs. A crock packed carelessly in October announced itself in March with a smell that meant a month's food was gone. Every one of those losses was a subtraction from a number that could never be added to, and within that dwindling pile there was one portion nobody was allowed to touch. The seed corn, the grain set aside for the spring sowing, sat apart from the rest and was guarded with something close to reverence because it was not food at all. It was next year. A household that ate its seed corn in March bought a few weeks and lost the following autumn, and every generation knew it. In ordinary years the sacks stayed sealed while the family thinned its own dinner around them, which tells you how far ahead these people were obliged to think. While the stores went down, the living animals stopped giving. Hens lay by daylight, and in the short months of a northern winter there is very little daylight to lay by, so the hens simply stopped, and the eggs that had been an everyday small kindness in June became, for a season, a memory. The cows went dry. A medieval cow gave a fraction of what a modern one gives even at her best, and in winter, thinly fed and usually carrying a calf, she gave nothing at all. So there was no fresh milk, no new cheese, no butter beyond what had been salted down in summer, and was by now tasting distinctly of its own age. The dairy, that great engine of the warm months, sat cold and idle. And nothing was growing. That is the part that is hardest to feel now, in a world of heated rooms. Out in the fields the winter wheat and rye were up, a thin green haze on the brown, but a growing crop is not food, and to eat it would have been to eat the summer before it existed. The garden had given its last kale and its last leeks and was down to bare stalks and frozen soil. The hedges were sticks. The woods were empty. Everything edible in the whole visible world was either already inside the house or 4 months away. So people stretched. That is the honest verb for what a February kitchen did. The pottage that had been thick and satisfying in November grew thinner in January, and thinner still in March, more water and fewer oats. The bones boiled a second and a third time, 1 onion where there had been 3, a handful of dried peas doing the work a piece of bacon used to do. The bread went darker and coarser and heavier, as the good grain at the top of the bin gave way to the poorer grain underneath. The small shriveled corn kept back because it was not fit to sell or to sow. It was ground fine, partly to make it go further, and partly because grinding it fine helped disguise what it was. In harder years the flour was extended with whatever could be persuaded to behave like flour. Bran meant for the animals, beans and peas ground down into a heavy dark loaf, ordinarily thought of as fodder, and in genuinely bad years, some accounts suggest, acorns. It filled a stomach. Nobody pretended it was pleasant. There is a particular kind of endurance in eating something dull and heavy every day for 8 weeks because it is what there is, and it did not make anybody heroic, and it did not make anybody complain much either. It was simply what February was. There was one other thing on the late winter table, and it came from the sea. Salted herring and dried stockfish travelled inland in barrels and bundles, and by the end of winter they were doing a great deal of quiet work in places that had never seen a coastline. Stockfish, dried hard as a board in the northern wind, had to be soaked for days and beaten before it would consent to become food again, and it was an acquired taste. But it kept for years, it travelled anywhere, and it was permitted on fast days, which mattered enormously because the fast days were about to arrive in force. And then, at exactly the moment the stores stood at their lowest, the first green things came. Not crops. Crops were months off, but nettles came up along the ditch backs and the muck heaps, the very first strong green in the whole landscape, and nettles cut young and boiled were eaten gratefully all over medieval Europe. Dandelion leaves came. Wild garlic came up in the damp woods in sheets, with that unmistakable smell that announces spring before the eyes have quite agreed to believe it. Sorrel, hedge shoots, cresses out of the running water. Everything that could be gathered was gathered, and what people described afterwards was not really the taste, which in the case of nettles is fairly modest, but the feeling. After 4 months of stored food, brown and salted and dried and boiled, something green and sharp and alive going into a body has an effect out of all proportion to its size. We would now explain that in terms of vitamins, and we would be right. The 40 days of fasting before Easterland, squarely in late February and March, in precisely the weeks when there was least to eat, and the Church's rules for those weeks set aside exactly the things that were already gone, meat, and in the stricter observance, eggs and milk and cheese and butter. They explained it as spring getting into a body, and they were also right. It is here, in this thin part of the year, that Lent falls. And it is worth saying carefully, because it is often said badly. As well. A modern person, hearing that sometimes reaches for a cynical explanation, as though the fast were a clever trick to disguise an empty larder. That is not what it was, and it is not how it was felt. Lent was old and serious, and it came from somewhere else entirely, from the desert and the 40 days and a long tradition of penitence that had nothing to do with grain stores. What is true is that the fit was extraordinary. Lent meant that going without had a shape and a reason and an end date, and that the whole village and the whole of Christendom were doing it together, and that the hunger felt on a Tuesday in March was not simply one family's bad luck with the grain bin, but something offered up. Something. A season of enforced scarcity and a season of chosen discipline lay exactly on top of one another, and the effect was not to trick anyone, but to transfigure something. Going without in March was going to happen regardless, shared, something with Easter at the far end of it. That is not a small thing to give people. It may be one of the kindest convergences in the whole history of the calendar. There was a bright edge to it too. The days before Lent began were Shrovetide, when a household used up the eggs and the fat and the last of the butter that would not keep through the fast, which is why so much of Europe still eats pancakes and fried dough at exactly that moment in the year. And through the fast the eggs, as the days lengthened and the hens remembered what they were for, began quietly to accumulate, uneaten, waiting, which is a large part of why eggs arrive with such ceremony at Easter. The calendar and the hen house were describing the same event. Meanwhile, the light was doing its patient work. Candlemas, the 2nd of February, sits at the midpoint between the shortest day and the equinox, and it carries several meanings at once with perfect ease. It is the feast of the presentation, 40 days after Christmas, kept with candles blessed and carried in procession, and it also marked, to anyone who had spent 3 months watching the dark, a change impossible to ignore. There was light at the end of the working day that had simply not been there in December. Country wisdom hung a great many weather sayings on Candlemas, most of them cheerfully contradicting one another, but underneath them lay a real observation. The year had turned, measurably, and a person could stand in a doorway at 5 in the afternoon and prove it. Then the lambs came. Use lamb in late winter, in the cold, which sounds like poor planning and is in fact the whole point, because it means the lambs are on grass the moment grass exists. And with the lambs came milk again, the first fresh milk in months, and soft new cheeses, and a house that had eaten nothing but salt and grain, since Martinmas suddenly had something white and mild and fresh in it. The shepherd's late winter was cold and sleepless, out in the wet at night with a lantern, and it was also the first real supply line to open since the autumn. The hay had been cut in June and had been feeding the surviving beasts since November, and by March it was down to dust and stalks. Straw was fed, though straw is nearly empty of nourishment. Leaves dried on the branch in summer were brought down. Everything that could be spared was spared, and still the cattle came out of the winter, gaunt and unsteady, their coats rough, their strength gone. It is said that in the worst springs the beasts had to be helped out to the first grass, too weak to walk to it themselves. And a weak animal in March meant a slow plough in April, which meant next year's harvest, which meant the winter after that. Nothing in that world happened only once. And sometimes, quietly, the arithmetic simply failed. It is worth saying briefly, because leaving it out would be dishonest. In the second decade of the 14th century, Northern Europe had 2 summers of extraordinary rain, one after the other. The crops did not ripen, the hay rotted where it lay. Salt could not be made properly in the wet, so what little there was could not be relied on to preserve anything. In a society with no reserves and no way to move food quickly, one failed harvest was very hard, and 2 in succession were beyond bearing. And the famine that followed reached across a great swathe of the continent and lasted years. Many died, in numbers that shocked the chroniclers who recorded it, and communities took a generation to recover. That is as much as needs to be said of it. It is the background against which every ordinary February should be understood, not because it happened often, but because everybody knew it could. Against that, and long before it, society had built something. Charity in winter was not a sentiment, it was an institution. Monasteries kept an almoner and gave doles at the gate, bread and the remains of the house's meals handed out on fixed days, and in the hard months the numbers rose, and the houses expected them to. Parishes had alms boxes and bequests, and guilds looked after their own poor. A manor had obligations that ran downwards as well as upwards, and a lord who let his people go hungry while his own barns stood full was not merely unkind, he was failing at the thing that justified him, and it would be said of him, in church and in the alehouse. It was uneven, sometimes grudging, and never enough in a truly bad year. But it existed, and it was expected, and in an average March it kept a great many households on the right side of the line. Below that ran something even more ordinary, which was neighbours. A bushel borrowed in March and returned in September, a pot of something carried next door because they had less. The long informal ledger of small debts and small kindnesses that every village keeps in its head, and which is the oldest welfare system there is. And then, one day, it broke. Not the calendar's spring, which arrives on a date and often means nothing, but the real one. A morning in April when the sun came over the roofline and had weight in it, actual warmth on the backs of the hands, the first warmth from the sky, rather than from the fire in perhaps 5 months. The door was propped open, and the smoke of half a year drifted out in a slow blue ribbon, and the room filled with air. Blankets went out over the hedge to lose their smell. There was mud instead of iron ground, and the wet earth smelled of itself again. Somewhere a lamb was making an idiotic noise. The pottage still tasted of March, and the bin was still nearly empty, and there were weeks yet before anything could be harvested. But the thing had been survived. The house had held, the fire had held, the stores had lasted, just, and the light was coming back with real heat in it. There is no modern equivalent of that feeling, because we have never been made to wait for it. They waited every year of their lives, and it came, and it must have been very close to joy. And in the middle of all that carefulness, the counted loaves, the watched barrel, the bread growing darker as the weeks went on. There is something that ought to be said plainly, because it is one of the oldest and gentlest misunderstandings about the medieval year. People sometimes imagine that a village in winter simply stopped, that the door was shut in November and opened again in March, and in between the whole place lay in a kind of long human hibernation, waiting for the light to come back. It is an appealing picture. It is also, as far as we can tell, not what happened at all. Winter did not end the work. It moved the work indoors and changed its shape and made it quieter. What the records actually show is a season stacked with jobs, most of them undramatic, many of them done sitting down, nearly all of them done within earshot of the fire or a short walk from it. The medieval year had a rhythm rather like breathing. Summer was outward, the fields, the light, the long back-breaking hours of hay and harvest that had to be taken while the weather allowed. Winter was inward, the barn, the byre, the hall, the hands. And the inward half of the year had its own long list, written into the estate books as carefully as the ploughing. Chief among those winter jobs, and the one that filled more cold mornings than any other, was threshing. When the grain came in from the harvest, it came in as sheaves, stalk and ear together, straw and seed still joined. It was stacked and stored that way on purpose, because grain keeps better in the ear, sheltered by its own husk, than it does loose in a bin. Which meant that all through the winter, in barn after barn across Europe, somebody was separating the two by hand. The tool was the flail, 2 lengths of wood, a long handle and a shorter beating stick, joined by a hinge of leather so the beater could swing free and come down flat. The floor was beaten earth, or laid boards in the middle bay of the barn, between 2 great doors set opposite each other in the long walls. Both could be opened at once, and that was not an accident of building. It was the entire point. Opening them turned the barn into a wind tunnel, and the draught that came through was what carried the chaff away. So the winter barn was cold, colder, often, than the yard outside, because no sun came into it and a steady wind ran through the middle. And yet threshers worked up a sweat, because swinging a flail for hours is genuine labour. 2 or 3 of them would fall into a rhythm together, alternating their strokes so the beats came evenly and nobody struck anybody else, and the sound carried a surprising distance across frozen ground. A slow, uneven drumming, from this barn and then that one, all down the valley. Around them the air filled with dust and chaff and fragments of straw, glittering where the light came in at the door, settling on wool and hair and eyelashes. It got into the throat. It smelled dry and sweet and faintly musty, the particular smell of stored grain which anyone who has opened an old barn still knows. And when the grain lay loose on the floor, it was winnowed. Someone would scoop it up in a broad, shallow winnowing basket and toss it into the air in the draught between the doors, again and again. The heavy grain fell straight back down. The light chaff drifted sideways and out. It is a gesture old enough to turn up in ancient poetry as an image for judgment, and it must have been oddly satisfying to do, the same lift and toss, the same soft rushing hiss, the pile at your feet growing cleaner every time. A household threshed what it needed, when it needed it, sack by sack through the winter, which meant that the grain heap in the barn was a kind of clock. You could look at it in January and see how far you had come and how far there was still to go. Meanwhile, inside the house, the other great winter work was going on, and it hardly ever stopped. Spinning. It is almost impossible to overstate how much of the medieval winter was spent turning fibre into thread, or how much of that was done by women. Every garment in the house, every sheet and sack and shirt and blanket began as a bundle of wool or flax that somebody had to spin, and spinning by hand is slow. It is often said that it took many spinners to keep a single weaver supplied, and whatever the true figure, that is the shape of the thing. Thread was the bottleneck of the entire clothed world. Before any of it could be spun, the fibre had to be prepared, and that too was winter's work. Wool was picked over for burrs and dirt, then combed or carded until it turned soft and cloudy. Flax was broken and drawn through the teeth of a comb until the woody husk fell away, and what remained was pale and faintly shining, like hair. Then the spinning itself. The older method used a distaff and a spindle. The distaff was a stick, sometimes carved, sometimes tucked under the arm or into a belt, that held the mass of prepared fibre. The spindle was a smaller stick, weighted with a whirl of stone or clay or bone, and it hung from the drawn-out thread, spinning as it fell, twisting the fibres into yarn. The genius of it is that it needed no table and no fixed place. A woman could spin standing, walking, watching a pot, minding a child, sitting on a stool in the last of the daylight by the door. Spinning was what the hands did when they were not doing something else. In the later Middle Ages the wheel arrived as well. Tall, turned by hand, standing in a corner and asking the spinner to step back and forth as she drew out the thread. The humble spindle never quite went away though, because it costs almost nothing and fits in a pocket. This is where a word in our own language comes from. A spinster was, quite literally, a woman who spins. The work was so universally women's work that the name of the worker slid sideways over the centuries and became a term for an unmarried woman, and then a rather unkind one. It began as a job description, and a completely ordinary one. In the same way, the distaff side of a family came to mean the female line, the household understood through the wool, and spinning was only the first of it. The winter house was a small workshop working by firelight. There was weaving, on an upright or a horizontal loom, in households that had one, though much cloth was woven by specialists in the towns. There was sewing and mending, garments patched, seams rerun, elbows and hems and knees repaired for the fifth time, because cloth represented hours of labour and was mended until it was rags, and then used as rags. In the later medieval centuries, knitting spread through Europe as well, a technique that seems to have arrived from the south and the east and become steadily more common. It needed only 2 needles and a ball of yarn, and could be done in the dim half of a room while other things went on. Then there was the rest of it, the endless, quiet manufacture that a household with no shops must do for itself. Rope twisted from hemp, baskets woven from willow, cut from the withy beds in winter, precisely because the wood was dormant, then soaked to make it supple. Wooden things whittled and shaped, spoons, bowls, handles for axes and hoes, rake teeth, the shafts of tools that had broken in the autumn. Harness stitched. Nets repaired. Rushes peeled and dipped in fat to make rushlights, so the evenings would have something to see by. Malt made and ale brewed, which in most households was a routine chore rather than an occasion. A man sitting with a knife and a piece of ash in the evening was not idling, he was replacing a tool. Because that was the deeper truth of the season, winter was maintenance. Everything the household owned that had been used hard from March to October now came in to be looked at. The plough was overhauled, a new share, a new stilt, a new mouldboard where it had worn thin. The cart was checked over, its wheels and axles greased or reset. Blades were ground to an edge, and the smith's forge was busy in a season when nothing else in the village was warm. Hurdles were made and mended, those movable wattle panels that penned sheep and could be carried on one shoulder. Fences were rebuilt, thatch patched where the autumn gales had opened it, gates rehung, sacks stitched. If you want a single image for the medieval winter, it is not sleep. It is a person turning something over in their hands, looking for the weak place and mending it before spring makes it urgent. The beasts kept over the winter, the plough oxen, the milk cow, if there was one, the ewes carrying next spring's lambs, could not go out and find their own dinner in a frozen field, so their dinner had to be carried to them morning and evening out of the hay cut in June and the straw and pea. Underneath all of it ran the one round that could never be postponed by so much as a day, which was the animals. Halm and lopped branches saved for exactly this. Water froze in the trough and had to be broken. The byre had to be mucked out, and the muck went onto the heap that would go onto the fields, which is its own quiet piece of good sense. So every winter day, whatever else happened, began and ended with someone crossing a dark yard with an armful of hay and their breath going up in front of them. And a good deal of winter work happened outdoors after all, deliberately, because the cold was what made it possible. Woodland work belonged to winter for a simple reason: the sap was down. Timber felled in the dormant season was drier, less prone to warp, and less likely to be attacked by insects. It seasoned better. So the felling was done in the cold, and so was coppicing, the ancient practice of cutting certain trees close to the stump so that they threw up a crop of straight poles from the living root to be harvested again in 7 years, or 12 or 15, and then again more or less forever. Hazel, ash, willow, alder. A well-run coppice is one of the most patient things human beings have ever built. A woodland farmed on a cycle longer than a childhood. Hedging and ditching belonged to the same season. Hedges were laid, the stems partly cut and bent over and woven along the line, so that they thickened into a living barrier no animal could push through, and the ditches beside them were cleared out, because water has to go somewhere, and a blocked ditch in February will drown a field. It was cold, wet, muddy, hand-numbing work in a raw wind, and it was also work with the shape of the coming year folded into it. The hedge laid in January was the fence that kept the beasts out of the corn in June. But some outdoor trades simply stopped, and stopped absolutely, because frost overruled them. Building was one. Lime mortar needs to cure, and mortar that freezes before it has set is ruined. The cold gets into the joint, and the wall comes apart. So the great building seasons ran roughly from spring to late autumn, and when the hard frosts arrived, the masons put down their tools. What they did then is one of those details that makes the past feel suddenly very close. They capped the unfinished walls, packing straw or thatch or dung over the top course, so the wet could not soak in and freeze and crack the work apart. Half-built cathedrals across Europe spent their winters wearing little roofs of straw. Quarrying slowed too, and the workforce turned to other things until the ground softened. Into this working season, the church and the calendar set the year's best run of holidays, and they were not decoration. They were structural. Advent came first. Several weeks of preparation and restraint leading up to Christmas, quieter and plainer in diet. And then, at midwinter, at the very darkest and leanest looking end of the year, came the 12 days. Christmas, in a medieval village, was a real holiday, of a kind our own working year rarely matches. 12 days from Christmas Day to Epiphany, in which the ordinary labour services owed to the Lord were in many places set aside. Some manorial customs record tenants coming up to the hall for a Christmas dinner, sometimes bringing something with them, a loaf, a dish, firewood, a hen, and being fed in return. There was meat, in a year when meat was rare. There was ale brewed specially. There was greenery carried indoors, holly and ivy, and whatever else stayed green when nothing else did. There was singing and dancing and games, and in some places the custom of misrule, when the ordinary order of things was cheerfully turned upside down for a few days, and a servant or a boy was crowned for the occasion, everyone enjoying the joke on the shared understanding that it would end. And it did end. The first Monday after Epiphany was Plough Monday, when work resumed and, in parts of England, the plough itself was hauled through the village with a good deal of noise and dressing up and collecting of small coins for the parish. After that, Candlemas at the beginning of February, the feast of the Purification, when candles were blessed and carried in procession, a festival of light arriving exactly as the light itself began, unmistakably to return. And then Shrovetide, the days of confession and of finishing up the eggs and the fat before Lent began, which is where the pancake comes from, and a fair amount of noise and football and mischief besides. Between the feasts there were the evenings, and the evenings are where a great deal of what we now call folk culture was actually made. There is a practical reason so many old songs and so many long tales of heroes and saints and talking animals belong to winter. Winter is when people sat still, together, in the only warm room with nothing to look at but the fire and each other. Stories are what fill hands. Busy, eyes idle time. Someone spins, someone whittles, someone tells. There were riddles, and collections of them survive from the early Middle Ages that are still funny and still sly. There were board games, merrills scratched onto a bench, tables played with dice, chess in wealthier houses. There were dice everywhere, and disapproval of dice everywhere, in roughly equal measure. And there was music, whatever anyone could play, and singing, which cost nothing at all. And because everybody was at home and nobody was in the fields, winter was when the community did its official business. The manor court often met in the quiet season, dealing with the small dense stuff of village life, boundaries, strays, debts, who had let a pig into whose garden, who owed what work to whom. The parish gathered too. It was the season for settling things, for agreeing next year's arrangements, for the slow talking out of disputes left standing all summer because there was no time, which means the picture to hold is not a sleeping village at all. It is a lit room in the middle of a dark countryside, full of noise and hands and argument and laughter, with the flails going in the barn across the yard. Sooner or later, of course, somebody had to open the door. For all the long evenings of spinning and mending and slow talk by the fire, the world beyond the threshold did not politely stop existing between Martinmas and Easter. It went on. It simply went on much more slowly. And to understand a medieval winter properly, it is worth stepping out of the smoke and standing in the lane, where the cold is real and the light is already going, to see what the season did to a whole civilization's ability to move. Start with the roads, because almost everything else follows from them. The great paved roads of the Roman world had been built to last, and in places they did last, but by the central Middle Ages, most of what people actually travelled on was not a road in any sense we would recognize. In autumn the rain arrived, and the same track became a trough of mud, churned deeper by every animal that passed, until in the worst stretches a laden cart could sink to its axle and simply stay there, and the traveller's whole day became a matter of ropes, oxen, patience, and a considerable. It was a track, a right-of-way worn into the ground by centuries of feet and hooves and cartwheels, unmetalled, undrained, following the contour of the land and the memory of habit. In summer it was hard and dusty and perfectly serviceable. Amount of language. And then the frost came, and the mud stopped being soft, which is the part that is easy to miss. A frozen road sounds like an improvement, and sometimes it was if the freeze came down onto a smooth surface. But a road that had been churned to porridge and then hardened overnight was a landscape in miniature, all crests and hollows and hoof-shaped pits, rigid as stone and sharp at the edges. Ruts froze into ridges hard enough to snap a wheel spoke or crack an axle, and there is something particularly disheartening about a wheel breaking on a road that looks like the best it has been in weeks. Horses went lame on it, oxen slipped. In hill country the same freeze put a glaze on every slope, and a cart with no brakes worth the name and a ton of grain behind it does not want to go down a frozen hill. Where the snow lay deep and stayed, though, some places turned the problem into a solution. In the north, where winter could be relied upon, goods went by sledge, runners instead of wheels, gliding over the packed white surface that had swallowed the road, and timber and stone and barrels moved more easily in January than they had in June. That is one of the quiet reversals of the medieval year. The season that stopped everything in one country opened the forests in another. Elsewhere, travel simply slowed almost to nothing, and everybody planned around it. The medieval year had a shape, and part of that shape was a long closure. Armies campaigned in summer and went home. The great trading fairs clustered in the open months. Kings and their households, who spent much of the year moving from manor to manor, eating their way through the stores as they went, tended to settle more heavily in winter. Journeys that had to happen in the dark months happened on horseback rather than by cart, or on foot, in short stages between known stopping places, because the other constraint was daylight, and there was very little of it. Someone setting out at first light might have 7 or 8 usable hours, and none of them bright, and nobody wanted to be caught in open country at dusk in February with nowhere to sleep. Where there was a river, everything changed. Water was the medieval highway. A pack horse carries what a pack horse carries. A barge on a quiet river carries the equivalent of a small caravan, at a fraction of the effort, and it does not care whether the towpath is muddy. Grain, wool, timber, stone for cathedrals, barrels of wine and salted fish, all of it moved by water wherever water was available, and a town on a navigable river was a town with a future. Winter did not necessarily stop that. Rain that ruined a road could raise a river to a useful depth, and a boat glided serenely over the same weather that had a carter arguing with a ditch, until it froze. Then the best road in the district became a solid white lane going nowhere. Boats were caught where they lay and had to be hauled out, and the ice, when it finally moved, was not gentle. A river that freezes hard and then thaws sends slabs downstream with the whole weight of the current behind them, and those slabs took out fish weirs, jetties, mill wheels, and, in bad years, bridges. The watermills stopped too, which mattered more than it sounds, because a village that cannot grind cannot easily eat its own grain. The hand quern came out of the corner again, and where the Lord's mill held a monopoly, there were arrangements to be made and tempers to be managed. Even the fish ponds froze over, and somebody had to break the ice so the carp could breathe. Out at sea the closure was more formal still. Medieval ships were superb at what they did, but they were built for a certain kind of weather, and winter in the North Sea and the Baltic is not that kind of weather. Navigation depended on knowing the coast, watching the sky and keeping landmarks in sight, and winter takes all of that away at once. Short days, low cloud, fog, gales that blow for a week, and a lee shore nobody can see. So the sailing season had edges. Broadly, trade went out in spring and came home before the worst of it, and there was a long stretch of the year when a great many ships were simply laid up, unrigged, drawn up on a beach or moored in harbour, with their crews dispersed inland. It is said that some maritime regulations forbade voyages altogether in the deep of winter, which tells you both how dangerous it was and how tempting the profits must have been. That closure shaped the calendar of business as firmly as the harvest shaped the calendar of the fields. Debts fell due at the ends of seasons. Contracts were written around the last sailing and the first. Wine came north in the autumn, and if it did not arrive then, it did not arrive until spring. A merchant in a port town spent the winter over his accounts, writing letters that would travel slowly, if at all, and waiting. A certain kind of medieval anxiety belongs entirely to that waiting, when a ship is somewhere out in the dark of the year and no one will know anything for months. The same closure fell across the building trades, and it left traces we can still read in stone. Mortar does not set in frost. It freezes instead, and when it thaws it crumbles, and a wall raised in a hard December may not be much of a wall by spring. So the building season had edges too. Masons worked from somewhere around the start of spring into the autumn, and as the cold came on, the unfinished tops of walls were covered over, with straw, with dung, with whatever would hold a little warmth and keep the wet out of fresh work, and the site was closed down for the year. The lodge, the timber shed where the masons cut and drew and sheltered, kept a quieter life going through the dark months, tools mended, stone dressed under cover, templates and drawings prepared for the spring. But the great churches rose in summers, and paused, and rose again the following summer. And part of the reason they took generations to finish is simply that for a third of every year the mortar could not be trusted. Winter in a town, meanwhile, was its own creature. Towns were crowded to begin with, and in winter they contracted further. Everybody pulled inward toward whatever gave heat. The streets were narrow, the upper stories leaned out over them, and by the middle of the afternoon the light had gone from the lanes, so that shops were shuttered early and the working day ended when the eye gave out. Markets thinned, and what the carts still brought in from the villages had mostly been grown months before. Above all of it sat the smoke. Every house was burning something, and in still cold weather that smoke did not rise and disperse. It settled, layer on layer, and hung over the roofs in a brown haze you could taste. In London, where sea coal was being burned in growing quantities, complaints about the smell of it reach us from as early as the 13th century, along with a certain amount of official hand-wringing that seems to have changed very little since. And under everything, always, the fear of fire. A medieval town was timber and thatch and daub, packed tight, with straw underfoot and open hearths and rushlights and a following wind. Fire in such a place was not an accident. It was a civic emergency, and everyone knew it. This is where the word curfew comes from. Not a rule about being off the streets, originally, but from the French for covering the fire. At the ringing of the evening bell the household damped the hearth, or set over it the curfew itself, a broad metal cover like an upturned pot that smothered the flame while keeping the embers alive until morning. Towns kept ladders and iron hooks in each ward for pulling burning thatch off a roof before it took the neighbours with it, and householders could be required to keep a vessel of water by the door. After serious fires, ordinances pushed for party walls of stone and roofs of tile or slate instead of thatch. Winter concentrated all of it, because winter was when every fire in the town was burning at once and burning hard. But the ice was not only trouble, and this is the part of the story people remember. When a great river froze solid, a town was handed something extraordinary, a wide, flat, empty public space where there had never been one. And medieval people, being human, went out onto it. Chroniclers record the Thames freezing hard enough to walk on more than once, with people crossing on foot where the ferry usually went. The famous frost fairs, with their booths and their printing presses, belong mostly to later centuries. But the impulse behind them is old and entirely recognizable. Fires lit on the ice, food sold, sliding and games and racing, apprentices skidding about on skates cut from bone and strapped under. It helped that the old London Bridge, crowded with houses and standing on broad piers, slowed the water almost to a standstill above it, so the river there had every encouragement to set. Their shoes, pushing themselves along with a pole. It is said that a description of 12th century London records exactly that. Young men sliding and racing on the frozen marsh outside the walls, and it is one of the most cheerful things to survive from the period. The river, that busy, dangerous working thing, had turned for a few weeks into a fairground. Those hard freezes came more often as the Middle Ages went on. For a long stretch, roughly from the 10th century into the 13th, much of Europe seems to have enjoyed a genuinely kind climate, mild enough that vines were worked further north than we might expect, and settlement pushed up into land that would later be given back. Then, from around the 14th century, the weather turned. Historians call the long cooling that followed the Little Ice Age, and it was not a sudden plunge into an ice age. It was a slow tilt of the odds, more bad years, wetter summers, winters that arrived earlier and held on longer. A growing season chafed at both ends, which, in a world living close to its harvest, is a very serious matter. The consequences were written most starkly at the edges, where the margin had always been thinnest. Upland farms that had been worked through good generations were let go. Fields at the high limit of cultivation went back to grass. Historians still debate why, and the honest answer is probably several things at once. The cooling seas and the ice, yes, but also the collapse of the trade that made the colony worth supplying, the difficulty of farming European livestock on thin northern soil, and the ordinary arithmetic of A. And far out in the North Atlantic, the Norse settlements in Greenland, planted in the warmer centuries, living on their animals, their sea hunting, and a long thread of trade back to Europe. Thinned and faded across the 14th and 15th centuries until they were simply not there anymore. Small community too far from everywhere. The last written trace of them that survives is said to be the record of a wedding. After that, silence. That is the wide, cold background. In the foreground, in the imagination of ordinary people, winter had a shape and a face, and often it was the wolf. The real danger was smaller than the fear, and it is worth saying so plainly. Wolves lived in the forests and hills of much of Europe, and were a genuine nuisance in winter when hunger brought them nearer to the folds. The losses that mattered were sheep and the occasional calf, and there were men who held their land on the condition that they kept the wolves down, which tells you it was a practical, managed problem rather than a nightly terror. In England they were already scarce, and eventually vanished altogether. But the fear was enormous, and it lived exactly where you would expect, in the dark, in the cold, at the edge of the firelight. It is said that an old name for January meant the wolf month. In stories, the wolf is winter walking about, hungry, patient, out there beyond the hedge, and in the fables he is the one who is always famished and always outwitted, which is its own kind of comfort. Every household knew the sound of the dobs going off in the night, and the way everyone paused, listening, before deciding it was nothing. And then there was the snow itself, which was both of those things at once, the danger and the beauty, refusing to be separated. Snow could close a pass, bury a track, scatter a straying flock, and shut a household in for days on whatever it had. It could also be the loveliest thing anyone saw all year. A village under fresh snow goes quiet, in a way that nothing else makes it go quiet. Sound is swallowed. In the morning, the story of the night is written across it in tracks. The small stitched line of a bird, the neat prints of a fox crossing the yard, the drag of something heavier along the hedge. And the children, who have no obligation to find winter grim, were out in it doing what children have. One of the most famous images of the whole period is a February farmyard under snow, with the sheep pressed together in the fold, birds picking at the ground where grain has been scattered for them, smoke going up from the chimney, a man leading a laden donkey toward a village on the hill. And the ruts are smoothed over, the mud and the ordinary shabbiness of a working farmyard vanish under a clean surface, and the whole place is briefly transfigured. Always done. Medieval people noticed this. It is in their art. Household inside, warming themselves at the fire, the wall cut away so we can see them. It is in their poetry too, where the ice cracks and the snow comes shivering down, and a night rides north through sleet with nowhere to sleep. They knew perfectly well how hard it was. They painted it beautifully anyway. And so the year goes on turning, and somewhere in the middle of all that cold, without any announcement at all, winter passes its highest point and begins, very slowly, to give way. It does not feel like it at first. That is one of the quiet cruelties of the season, and one of the things medieval people understood in their bones. The shortest day comes in December, but the coldest weeks come afterwards, in January and February, when the land has had time to give up all the warmth it stored in summer. So the light comes back before the heat does. The days lengthen while the frost deepens, and people notice the light long before they felt any comfort in it, because light was measured in the most practical way imaginable, in candle ends and rushlight, and in the moment when the work in a person's hands could no longer be seen. The first sign was almost always the evening. Sometime in the middle of January, someone in a house would look up from a task and realize that they had not lit anything yet, and that the doorway was still holding a little grey daylight, and that this had not been true a fortnight ago. It is a small thing, and exactly the sort that people living close to the edge of a season notice with real force. The afternoon lasted a little longer. The animals could be seen to before dark. One more row could be finished, and the candle could be saved. That mattered more than it sounds. The working day in that world was set by the sun rather than by a clock, and the winter day was simply short. So every extra quarter of an hour of usable light was not a mood or a metaphor. It was more work done and less fuel burnt. By the beginning of February, the change was unmistakable enough to have a feast attached to it. Candlemas, the 2nd of February, was the day the church marked the presentation of the Christ child in the temple and the purification of his mother, and it was one of the loveliest days in the winter half of the calendar because of what was done with the candles. Candles were brought to the church to be blessed, and carried lit in procession, and taken home again to be kept through the year. In a season defined by darkness, here was a feast that put light into people's hands and made it holy. Some of those blessed candles were kept for the hardest moments a household might face, lit in sickness or in a storm. A candle that had been blessed was a small piece of the church's protection that could be held in the hand. In many places, Candlemas was also the day the last of the Christmas greenery came down. The holly and the ivy that had been up since the 12 days, gone brittle and dusty by now, taken out and burnt, so that the house stood plain again for the long haul to spring. Candlemas also sat almost exactly halfway between the shortest day and the spring equinox, and the country calendar had a great deal to say about it. There is an old rhyme, recorded in many forms and probably far older than any written version of it, which says that if Candlemas Day is fair and bright, winter will have another flight, and if Candlemas Day brings cloud and rain, winter is gone and will not come again. Which is to say, a fine clear day in early February means settled air and hard frosts still to come, and a wet grey one means the milder weather has arrived. There are versions of the same idea all across Europe, some involving an animal that comes out of its winter sleep, looks about, and goes back in if the day is too bright. This is folk wisdom rather than meteorology, and people knew the difference between a saying and a certainty. But such sayings carry a real observation inside them, and weather lore was a way of holding a pattern in the memory when almost nobody wrote anything down. And then, in the middle of the hardest weeks, the year did something quietly astonishing. It began producing life again. The ewes started to lamb. Lambing came in the late winter because the rams had gone to the flock in autumn, and it meant that some of the coldest and wettest nights of the whole year were spent out with the sheep or in a shelter of hurdles and thatch with a lantern, listening. A shepherd in February was doing one of the hardest jobs in the medieval countryside, and one of the most valued. Lambs born into sleet do not always live, but those that did meant wool in the summer, and, far more immediately, milk, and the first milk of the year. In a household that had been living on salt and grain since November was an extraordinary thing to have. Cheese could begin again. In much of England, the first Monday after Epiphany was Plough Monday, when work formally resumed after the 12 days of Christmas, and in some villages the plough itself was hauled around the houses with a good deal of noise and dressing up and collecting of small coins, part of which went too. Butter would follow later, when the cows calved and came back into milk. The animals were returning to life, and so, slowly, was the table. Around the same time the fields were taken up again. Keep a light burning in the church. It was half a working day and half a piece of theatre, and it did what a great many customs did, which was to draw a clear line between one part of the year and the next. There is a matching custom for the women, who took up the distaff again the day after Epiphany, with the young men trying to set the flax alight and the water thrown over them in return. Whether it was ever as riotous as the later accounts suggest, the shape of it is honest enough. Work resumed. The rest was over. The ploughing that followed was not comfortable work. February and March fields are cold and heavy, the ox team goes slowly, and the ploughman walks all day in mud. There was harrowing after the plough, and muck to be carted out and spread. But the spring sowing was the whole of the coming year's oats and barley and peas and beans, and everybody knew it. Meanwhile the hedges began to stir. The blackthorn threw out white blossom before it had any leaves at all, on bare black wood, often in the middle of a cold snap. The hawthorn came into tiny bright green leaf, and children ate the young leaves, and in some places called them bread and cheese. The sap rose in the willows, and the bark loosened, and anyone who has ever made a whistle from a green stick knows that there is a fortnight in spring when it works, and the rest of the year when it does not. Birds began singing before dawn, instead of keeping their winter silence. A poet of the later Middle Ages wrote of the day in February when the birds choose their mates, and while that was a courtly conceit, it was built on something real that anyone could hear in the hedge. All of that is the good side. Here is the other one, and it deserves its full weight, because this is the point in the year when the food ran out. Spring, not winter, was the hungry season. The stores filled in autumn had been eaten through for 4 or 5 months. The grain in the barn had to last until harvest and had to leave enough for seed, and seed corn was close to sacred because to eat the seed corn was to sell next year in order to buy today. The salted meat was down to the last of it. The stored roots and apples had gone soft, or gone. And the new growth in the fields was not food yet, because a green shoot in March is a promise, not a meal. So the weeks between the end of the old stores and the first of the new were the thinnest weeks of the year. Bread became coarser, eked out with barley and beans, and the pot had less in it. People went out to the hedges and the ditch banks for the first green things, the nettles and the early leaves, which are not a meal either, but a something. And in a bad year, after a wet harvest, thin became worse than thin, and people went hungry, sometimes a great many of them at once. That is simply true, and no amount of firelight in the telling should be allowed to cover it over. Which brings us to Lent, and to something that has to be said carefully, because it is easy to be cynical about it, and the cynicism would be wrong. Lent, the 40 days of fasting before Easter, fell exactly across those thinnest weeks. Meat was set aside. In many places, eggs and butter and cheese went with it. And it is perfectly true that this was a religious observance and not a rationing scheme. People fasted because the church taught that fasting prepared the soul, and they understood it as penance, not as household economy. But it is also true that the two fitted one another, and medieval people were quite capable of seeing that. A discipline that asked you to eat less of the very foods that were scarcest, at the very moment they were scarcest, is a genuine convergence between the spiritual year and the working one. It turned a hard stretch into a shared one. Everybody was going without together, and going without on purpose, which is a very different feeling from simply having nothing. What filled the gap was fish and beans and pottage, the salted herring and the dried fish laid in for exactly this, week after grey week. Before it began they were Shrovetide, and the small domestic sense of that is a delight. The eggs and the butter and the fat in the house had to be used before the fast, so they were used, in pancakes and fritters and rich fried things, and the last of the good fat went into one bright, greedy day. Then the ashes on the forehead the following morning, and the long quiet stretch. And at the end of it, Easter, arriving at the exact moment when the countryside itself was coming back. That is why those foods carry the meanings they carry. Eggs mean Easter because hens, with the returning light, begin laying properly again after a winter of almost nothing. And because eggs had been set aside all through Lent and could finally be eaten, and because an egg is such an obvious image of a sealed and silent thing with life inside it. Milk and butter mean Easter because the cows had calved and were in milk again. Lamb means Easter for reasons deep in the scripture, and also, quite simply, because that is when there were lambs. The feast was not arbitrary. It sat on top of the real return of food to a real table, and the gladness in it was not only theological, it was the gladness of butter after a long time without any. So what did they understand that we have mostly stopped understanding? That a year is one connected system, for a start. Nobody in that world could have thought of winter as a separate thing that simply happens to you. Winter was the second half of summer's work. The wood on the fire in January had been cut and stacked to dry the previous spring. The bacon in the rafters was the pig that ate the acorns in October. The candle was the fat of an animal the household had fed all summer. Every warm hour in December had been paid for by a sweating hour in July, and everyone from the child scaring birds off the seed to the Lord's reeve knew the arithmetic. We have broken that link almost entirely, and mostly we're better off for it. But something went with it, the sense that the pleasant part of the year and the hard part of the year are the same year. They understood that a household is a unit and not a collection of individuals. It cooked at one hearth, ate from one pot, worked at one set of tasks, and slept close together because bodies keep each other warm, which was the plain sense of it. Warmth was pooled like everything else. They understood that light is precious, not as a sentiment, as a fact. Light was expensive, it was rationed, it was carried carefully through a draft with a hand cupped round it, and its return in February was a matter of real relief and real gratitude. We flood our rooms with it for nothing and have almost no relationship with it at all. And they understood that warmth is something you make. It is a verb. You make it out of fuel you gathered, and a fire you tend, and wool you spun, and walls you daubed, and people you sit close to. Nobody was ever warm by accident, none of which should make anyone wish to have lived it. It was cold in a way that is hard to imagine from inside a heated room, cold indoors, cold in bed, cold on waking. It was dark for 16 hours. The smoke got into people's chests, and the damp got into their clothes. The same food came round again and again, and in a bad year the food stopped coming round at all. Some accounts suggest that more deaths fell in winter and early spring than in any other part of the year. It was not cosy. It was survived. And yet, and this is the strange true thing, the customs that came out of those winters are among the warmest things human beings have ever made. The circle round the fire. The stories told in the dark because the dark was long and had to be filled. The 12 days of feasting placed deliberately at the blackest point of the year, when it made no economic sense at all, and every kind of human sense. The neighbours who came in and were fed, because next year it might be you at their door. People took the worst part of the year and built their best habits there. We keep them, mostly, without knowing why. A great feast at midwinter. Candles at the darkest point. The instinct to draw indoors and shut the door and be with the people we belong to. Food that is heavy and slow and comforting, the stews and the roots and the baked things, winter foods in their bones. Even the way we talk, still, about getting through the winter, as though it were a thing to be got through, which for most of human history it was. So it is March now, in that house we began with, on the morning when everything finally tilts. The fire is low but not out. It has not been out since autumn. There is still a rime of frost on the thatch, and mud everywhere, and the last of the salt bacon hanging in the smoke. But when the shutter comes down from the little window, the air that comes in through the gap is not the air of January. It has softened. It smells of wet earth rather than iron. There is a blackbird somewhere being ridiculous about it. The light coming through is a different colour, and it reaches further into the room than it did a month ago. Someone stands there a moment with a hand on the shutter and does not say anything, because there is nothing much to say. The winter has been got through. Again. It will come back, and they will do it again, and the wood for it is already being thought about. The fire settles, the light lengthens. And the house, which was built for exactly this, goes quietly on into the spring.